And welcome to College Football Tradition here on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you find your podcast. My name is Brian Partika. I'm joined alongside Jacob Vanderford, my co-host, my bro host, and we are here doing our first inaugural episode of a series that we're doing that may just take us centuries to finish, but it is a series about what we're going to talk about with all the different seasons of college football history. We're going to go through every season of college football. We're going to look at who was recognized as national champions, what happened in that year of the sport, who claims a national title, who doesn't claim one, who should be the national champion of that year, and all the different funny and quirky stories that have happened throughout this great sport and the 150 plus year history of it. Jacob, I'm really excited to get started. How are you feeling about this series as we kick this off with the 1869 college football season?
This is going to be a wild ride, folks. Me and Brian have been cooking up some fun little series and seasons for you for the year until we get back to our college football season here in 2025, 2026 coming up. So, yeah, definitely just looking forward to getting started. I'm going to be learning a lot as we go as well. Brian knows a lot about football. I pretend to know a little bit.
Oh,
And
stop,
so
stop. You
we're
know so much.
stop. So we're gonna be learning along with you, sharing some facts, some fun little tidbits, just sharing like our opinions as well. So I hope you have a fun time following along on this podcast journey.
Yeah, and we're going to try to keep these episodes a little bit shorter than our regular episodes as well. So hopefully throughout this series, you'll be able to follow along and go back, resort back if you need to. But that 1869 college football season, we'll start there. For those of you who don't know, it started in New Brunswick, New Jersey, two teams from New Jersey, and that was the Rutgers College, so now known as Rutgers University in the Big Ten, and then the College of New Jersey, which is now Princeton in the Ivy League. Those were the first two programs in college football. And really, what the sport looked like during that time was more of a soccer kind of vibe. It really didn't look like football. There weren't deep passes. It was more blocking and running of the football. But a lot of the rules came from the association football rules used in England, which would eventually become what we know as soccer today. So a lot of different soccer aspects, and actually a lot of the different college national champions that were named for soccer are just these football teams, which I think is so unique. Like, what do you like? That's so wild that a lot of the college national champions for soccer are really just these former football teams that we know of today and we use as football national champions.
Yeah, I mean it's crazy, and like you think about, a lot of people think about rugby, soccer, all of those things reminiscent of football, and it's also weird to think about like, oh, okay, like these sports very like primitive, formative sports that really shaped humanity. Like, cavemen. If you think back to the cavemen years, were they playing soccer or rugby? Maybe they had a little stick or, a little apple that they were throwing around, kicking around. Who knows? But some of the as those have kind of like evolved and everything. Now we're here in 1869, playing soccer and football. And I was just reading up a little bit on this, but like it's and not even looking at 1869, but fast forwarding, like the rules that we now know of football come from a Tufts and Harvard college game in 1875. And so like it took all that time, 7 years from 1869 to 1875 to really build up what we know as college football.
Yeah, yeah, and that's so interesting. The 1870s have so many time periods where a lot of programs met together and they were trying to go over the rules and they debated a lot with what that looked like. But what made 1869 so interesting was that the first game was at Rutgers on November 6th. And that game between Princeton and Rutgers, they played by Rutgers home rules. So they played by Rutgers rules, and it ended in a 6-4 victory for the Queensmen, which are now the Scarlet Knights. They were known as the Queensmen back then.
Queensman.
The Queensmen. And later on, they went to Princeton. So just about a week later, they went over to Princeton, Rutgers did, and they played by Princeton rules. And that's when the free kicks started. So any player that caught the ball on the fly was able to continue running with the ball, which was a new rule. So Princeton was able to play to their speed advantage at the time. Even though you really can't find the rosters of these two squads, you knew that Princeton had a speed advantage. That's one of the records of these games that we knew about. And Princeton ended up squashing Rutgers. They did it 8-0. It was not a close competitive match, that second one. But there are very few documented things about these first two college football games. Very few documented things. But one thing that we do know is that a third game was supposed to be played. A third game to break the tie, to have the tiebreaker of all tiebreakers. But the faculty at both institutions thought it was getting in the way of the young men and their studies at the time. So they were getting angry about that. And then also which rules to play under. Princeton and Rutgers were debating which rules should we play under for this third game. Our rules, your rules, what should we play by? So that third game never happened. And I think that that really set a precedent for the future of the sport of how many years where we did not have one true champion. We just had a lot of shared titles. We didn't have a playoff system. We didn't have a tiebreaker format. And I think that really shaped the sport in that it was so important to beat your rival and it was so important to win home games. I mean, we didn't have a team win on the road for a couple of years into the sport. Really, it was home teams that were winning at first. But I just thought it was so interesting that the faculty had to get involved and stop this third game from ever happening.
Yeah, it's funny to me how like the rules were such a big part of this football game. Like, why couldn't these teams? These are Princeton and Rutgers men. You know, like these are like two of the main colleges at the time. Princeton obviously is one of the top Ivy League schools. Like you'd think that some of these like well-learned individuals would know like, oh, like let's come up with a constitution or let's come up with a, you know, a document that has all of the different laws and rules of what we want football to be. But no, they were just like, oh, we're gonna when we're at Rutgers, we're gonna play by Rutgers rules. When we're at Princeton, we're gonna play by Princeton rules. So like it's really interesting how that home field advantage from a very early time kind of came into play as well. I do want to correct myself from earlier. This is why I'm not a math person. Definitely messed up the years. So, but that's okay. It's all good.
Yeah.
Anyways, yeah, when I see the free kick, that I always think about like soccer when they have that penalty kick. So that just kind of makes me think about like, oh, like this is the first time we had like the kickoff and the punts and like all of those things. And like it's interesting how from an early age too that it started more of like running the football. And I always hear in college football today, like, let's get back to our roots and run the ball. Like there's so much scheme and passing and what have you within the offensive game where I feel like some teams, when you think about, say, like Georgia Tech or like Navy or Army, like those teams, Air Force as well, those teams all like run the ball and have that triple option and things. That's what I visualize when I think about like the very first college football game here in 1869. So yeah, it's very, very strange to think about and like put myself back in that time period. Like what would it have been like to like be in the audience and watch this very first match?
And I'm glad you brought up the audience point too, because a lot of these early college football games throughout the first decade, you could find records of roughly how many people were in attendance at some of these things. You can't for these first two games, so it's estimated that only a few dozen people were at the first couple games. But once you get 10 years down the road, 15 years down the road, we're talking late 70s, late early 1880s, it comes to a point where there are 10 or 15,000 people at some of these games already, which is just bonkers. I mean, there are some lower level FBS games that don't get that. But those first two games between Princeton and Rutgers weren't very well attended, but they were attended by people. And there was not a lot of records, but at least we know the scores of what those games were. Something else we're going to talk about in this series are the key wins of teams that claim national titles. So Princeton and Rutgers are both recognized national champions for that year by the NCAA and also by Park H. Davis. He was a historian of college football during the before his death in the 1930s. So he retroactively named a lot of national champions. Certainly someone that we could look to throughout this history to talk about who were the dominant teams during the early couple of decades. We're also going to talk about the key wins that each team had. Each team beat the other in this season. And we also know that Rutgers lost to Princeton 8-0 in that second game. But also both teams were playing by the home rules. So it's kind of impossible to say who really deserved the national title in 1869. So we retroactively as well granted to Princeton and Rutgers. But if you had to pick one, Jacob, of these two teams, who would you have picked?
I think I'm going to pick Princeton, just because of that match where they just demolished Harvard 8-0. I think that's just kind of hard to overcome. And then,
Oh, Rutgers.
did I say Rutgers?
Oh, you said Harvard. And I was like, you got a
Oh,
couple
wait,
more
what?
years left.
Oh my gosh. Sorry, folks. My brain. Princeton beat Rutgers. Yes, 8-0. And then the first game was it 6-4? Is that
Yeah,
correct?
6-4. Yep.
Okay. Yeah. So I think like that was just a much closer game. And could have been a toss up either way. So I think Princeton, if given another shot, would have had that third game.
Yeah, I think so too. I think especially because as you're going to see throughout the next couple of years, they are really the program that is going to really dominate the conversation in terms of what the new rules are going to look like and what the gameplay is going to look like, what the field dimensions are even going to look like. But it's so interesting that you brought up Harvard too, because a lot of those Ivy League schools in the 1870s and the 1880s, they were taking shape. And we'll be certain to talk about the Yale Bulldogs. We'll be certain to talk about the Harvard Crimson, because those were some of the teams that really stuck out as the early days of the sport came to. Jacob, any final thoughts on 1869, that college football season?
One thing that is so interesting to me about, and you talk about the Ivy League schools, like today you don't really see anything or hear anything about these Ivy League schools in college football. So it's like, why did those teams kind of fall off the face of the earth in terms of like having that national prominence? Like this was the first game, and like Princeton beat Rutgers 8-0, and then we fast forward again, like I talked about in 1875, and Harvard and Tufts play. Like, I mean, you don't see those teams really in college football anymore. It's your Alabamas of the world, your Georgias, and your SEC, Big Ten, all these conferences realignment. At this time, there were only two teams. It was a much simpler game. The other thing that I want to point out that I was just thinking about is like it's so interesting how American sports kind of created themselves entrepreneurially, if I can say that, if that's even a word. Like I think since America left from Great Britain and came over, like we're kind of making everything from scratch. And like this football game, like we're kind of taking some things from soccer, from rugby, more like European, more I guess, what is that? Eastern European, I don't know. But that side of the world, you're seeing a lot of those sports kind of get cultivated there, and then we bring over some of the little tidbits and things that we see and then put them into our own sports. And it's interesting that we'll see over this series how much the game of college football has grown since the very early years of planting the seed of this is what the game could be, and then adding in new rules, creating new structure, new documents, and things like that to really put into, I guess, cement what college football is.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm really glad you brought up again those Ivy League institutions and that we don't really hear about them today. That's one thing conference realignment can't touch is the Ivy Leagues. But
Yep.
the Ivy League now, they are in the FCS, but they do not currently play in the FCS playoffs. Ivy League schools, they play in the playoffs for and the postseasons for all other sports except FCS college football. But that's about to change, and Ivy is about to join the ranks of getting that automatic bid into the 2014 field of the FCS, which I think is going to be really exciting. So, used to be where they didn't send their champion like every other FCS conference does to the playoffs, because it conflicted with final exams. And they were also talking about player safety, and those additional games that playoff system has. But I'm so happy to hear that the Ivy Leagues are going to be back into the postseason format, because they are the most historic conference in terms of longevity, and it starts right here.
Maybe we'll see Princeton ruling the day again someday. Go
Wouldn't be a
Tigers.
bad thing. Go Tigers. Well, that's all we got for you on this first inaugural episode of our History of American College Football 1869. For Jacob Vanderford, I'm Brian Partika. We will see you next time.
See ya, Pete.